welcome to the StateImpact Indiana farm. We've got a barn, we've even got a cow. Moo. But what we're really here to look at are the silos, because we're here to talk about the siloed way that Indiana school district budgets are funded. You have to understand the silos exist for a reason, and it's a reason that's becoming increasingly important because you're hearing about it more on the news with these property tax caps, or maybe your district is looking at passing a referendum in the upcoming election. So we're here to sort of talk about how the budget is set up, basically what each of these silos that you see here are, how these silos get filled up, and then how the property tax caps and referendums kind of change the way that budgeting is working in school districts in Indiana. So let's get started. So let's start with the silo here on the left, and we put it over on its own here on the left side on its own hill, if you notice, for a reason. This is called the general fund. We're going to put a big G on the board there for general fund, and this is where kind of the basic nuts and bolts of a school district is paid for. When you hear the general fund, think of teachers' salaries and janitors' salaries and tutors' salaries and the benefits for all of the employees of a school district, as well as all of the supplies that you need to run a classroom, basically. That's what the general fund pays for. Now, again, off on its own, on the left, for a reason. We'll get to that in a second. So let's go to these other funds here on this other hill on the right. We have one called the Capital Projects Fund, and we're going to call it CPF because that's what all those heady school budget finance types like to call it, the CPF, the Capital Projects Fund. Basically, your building fund. That's where you get your money to repair your buildings or build new buildings. And also some districts use it to pay for things like technology. So you pay for computers out of the CPF fund as well. So the other one that you have to probably think about, and one that you've heard a lot about, is we're going to label with a B. It's the bus fund. You probably heard a lot about that in Franklin Township, where they had those busing fees that you might remember that caused those long lines and traffic jams, and parents got mad, got the district hit with a lawsuit. Anyway, and we should add a disclaimer. The bus fund is actually a couple different funds, but school finance types don't write too many angry comments. We're just trying to simplify this. So the busing fund, it does what it sounds. It pays for buses, pays for repairing buses, pays for buying new buses, pays for fuel for the buses. There's basically an entire school district budget for buying buses and taking care of transportation needs. Now there's a last one that you really have to know about too. We're going to mark it with a D because it's called the Debt Service Fund. But when we say Debt Service Fund, don't think of debt like your credit card debt, and it's not a bad metaphor, but think more of your mortgage. That's what the Debt Service Fund is there for. It's an entire chunk of the school district's budget to pay your mortgage, basically. Because the school district, when they take out debt, they're probably doing it to build a building. And so there's an entire set-aside chunk of the school district budget to pay for basically the mortgage payments for a school building. They don't have $250 million lying around to build a new high school. You take out debt. You go out and buy a bond and then sell it, and then you go out and use that money to build the school district, but you have to pay it off eventually, and you do that out of this fund. Okay, you still with me? I really hope you're still with me. Okay, so let's talk about, now that we know what each of these silos does, let's talk about how each of these silos gets filled up with money. So we put the G, the general fund here, the operating expenses one, we put that on its own hill for a reason, because it's got its own separate funding source. Gets all of its money from the state. Used to be all local property taxes. Now it's all state dollars. Your state sales taxes go into a big pot of money up in Indianapolis, and then state lawmakers divvy it up and try and make it as equitable as possible for the districts that have more complicated students, like ones who are on free and reduced price lunch, and the students in special ed. They get a little bit more money than the districts who have fewer of those students. They try and make it as equitable as possible, but basically the general operating expenses of a district are, at least in intention of how the funding formula is set up, it's supposed to be equal, and it's on its own for a very special reason, and that's it, to try and make it as equitable as possible. Now, we put all of these other silos on the other side, on this other hill over here, because they have their own funding source, and it's the source you probably think of when you think of local school funding. It's local property taxes. All of these funds on the other side get paid for by your local property tax dollars. That's how, if a school wants to build a school or pay for buses or pay down their mortgage, they do it out of local property taxes. Okay, so property taxes. You have to understand what happens when property tax caps take effect. It was done out of a desire to lower everybody's tax bill, but a lower tax bill also means less money coming into school corporations, and especially school corporations where the school corporation isn't the only taxing entity around, like a police department or a fire department, a city. Those are places that are also levying local property taxes and getting money off of that too. The local property taxes, when you cap the amount of money you can get out of that, that means the school districts are going to get less money out of it. And when you're getting less money in your property tax supported funds, what it essentially does is it puts you in a pinch for paying off your debt. And this is why it's important to remember this and think of it like your mortgage. If you got your salary cut in half, it would be a lot harder to pay down your mortgage on your house, just like it would be harder for you to pay down the debt on your building if you're a school district. Now, let's take Franklin Township, because we keep coming back to it for a second because of that busing thing. And what you have to remember is that Franklin Township grew a lot. It had a substantial enrollment increase through the 90s and the 2000s, and they had to build a bunch of schools. Now remember, buildings equal debt. So this silo was huge. They had a lot of debt payments to make, and there's a lot of argument about whether or not they took out too much debt, whether or not they were building too many schools, whether they built them too extravagantly. Set that debate aside, there was a lot of debt. And when you have property tax caps, it's a lot harder to pay down your debt. And it's also harder to do things like make repairs on your buildings. And it's also hard to pay for busing. Again, these are the property tax supported funds. So what Franklin Township did was say, we're not going to pay for busing. We're just not going to do it. And we're going to use it to pay down our debt and try and shore up our finances and try and ride out this financial storm. The state legislature eventually stepped in, said you can't do that, but we're still left with this basic issue of the property tax caps. There's a remedy that we're writing about here on StateImpact Indiana. We're going to do a separate post about it, and you'll see that coming up in very shortly after we post this video. And also you'll be hearing about it on the radio, and it sort of talks about how this problem is fixed, or how at least there's a remedy that state lawmakers have presented to try and fix the problem. But what essentially Franklin Township did is say, we're not going to pay for busing. And that was the way that they made up for the shortfall in property taxes. All because they have to pay down what's here in their debt service fund, in their mortgage, basically their mortgage payments, they had to pay that down. So if voters want to go above the property tax caps in a district where they're already running up against those property tax caps, if they want to do something like pay for repairs to their school, which you do out of this silo, the capital projects silo, or build a new school, take out a $250 million bond to build a new high school or something like that, something you do out of your debt service fund, pay for new buses, which you do out of your transportation fund. What they're going to have to do if they're in a district that's running up against the property tax cap, the district is going to have to go to the voters and say, please raise your own property taxes. That's what the referendums you're seeing are for. You can do that on the property tax side, or you can do that on the general fund side as well if you want to raise more money for classroom operating expenditures. Here in Bloomington, they did that for Monroe County Community Schools. But essentially the idea here, and this is the debate, is whether or not this new system is better than the old system. Districts are worried that referendums aren't going to pass, and there are districts in which referendums haven't passed. But what state officials and the supporters of the cap say is that that's exactly the point. It used to be that school districts could raise property taxes whenever they wanted, essentially unchecked, is what I've been told by the state's budget director. But what he said to me in the story that we're about to post here very soon on StateImpact Indiana is that now taxpayers have a seat at the table. They have a say whether or not the district is making their case well enough, saying we have these needs, we need to renovate our building, we need to build a new high school. If the voter isn't convinced that that's necessary, they don't get the property tax revenue. So that's how things are here out on the StateImpact farm and how school districts are funded. It's complicated. If you've made it to the end, I'll give you a little bit of Bessie's milk. It's wonderful. Moo.